Spoken label. I haven't thought about flying for a long time. I haven't dreamed of that moment when I was alone above the clouds for a long time. I haven't dreamed of waking up in a room surrounded in blue and green grass for more years than I could dream of remembering. I haven't walked back into the past or scratched on the doors of my origins, where it all came from, since I held up that cape for the last time.
Return to Kent Town 10th Year Anniversary Edition is a revised version of Allende's first poetry book. The book can be purchased from Amazon and it contains numerous additional material.
Spoken Label. Hi, it's Allende from Spoken Label. Thank you today for streaming or downloading another episode of Spoken Label. Spoken Label was originally set up on beginning of 2016 and as of speaking has currently nearly 300 sessions. The full archive is available on Spoken Label bandcamp.com. Although it is available for free for stream and download if you wish, I am always grateful for any sort of kind of donation to enable me to keep the running costs of this podcast going. And enjoy. Take care. Bye bye. Spoken Label.
Hey guys, Allende, Spoken Label, back in the house on a Saturday afternoon. No, not a Sunday, a Saturday. It's my birthday tomorrow, so I've been banned from podcasting on Sunday. So we're doing it on Saturday today. But we've got a wonderful writer and artist with us today. Now, thanks to Nadia, her agent, for this, because I've dealt with Nadia several times now, and she's referred over to me a wonderful lady called Janet Sternburg. Now, Janet is originally from the Boston, Massachusetts area in the United States, and she'll tell us all the story in a minute, but she's now in LA at the moment, but has spent quite some substantial time in Mexico. Okay, Janet, to start off with today then, I think we should tell people a little bit about your background, because I know you've been involved in the arts, haven't you, for many years now, as far as I can see, into the 1970s. So what started you off in this projection you're on nowadays?
Well, if we knew, any of us, not just me, where our creativity comes from or came from, we would have the key to a great secret in the world that others want to know. All I can say originally is by way of anecdote. Little girl in Boston, age, give or take 7, going to the movies with my parents to see, of all things, but realistically it was wonderful, I think, Walt Disney's movie Fantasia. And if you see that, or people listening, you should just know that it is an animated film unlike anything that Disney had ever done before, in that it's really an experiment in classical music, that's the voiceover, of different sorts, and a mixture of different kinds of visuals that he put to the music. And at 7, I found this absolutely thrilling, so much so that when I got home, I asked my mother for a pencil and a piece of paper, because it was so thrilling I had to write something about it. God knows what I wrote, but that feeling of pressure, of first of all, of inspiration, of response, of I've got to say something about this. I would say that was my first inkling that I would be someone with things to say in different art forms for the rest of my life. I could say, did it come from my parents? Probably not at all. One never knows. Not that they were necessarily creative or not creative, simply that was not their path in life. I have a strange thing I will tell you about, and then I will stop, and that is my mother was one of 6 children, 5 women, 1 man, and all of them, they only had 4 children in total. That means my generation, 4 of us, 3 of whom turned out to be writers. And so my aunt used to say, "You've inherited the writing gene." What that says about the origin of creativity, I do not know. We could trace it and trace it, but it's kind of interesting, isn't it, to have such mystery in our lives about what makes us who we are.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely there. Because I think I'm in a similar boat to you, like, because my family are not creative at all. My wife is, but I think that's what brought us together. But you're right, it's life goes in strange patterns sometimes with your family straight away with it. So I agree with you. Now, we're here today, obviously, to talk about your new book, looking at Mexico, and Mexico Looks Back. But before we do that, I think there's a couple of things I want people to be aware of, because you're certainly known for doing the book on the editing of the writer on her work. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that book then before we start?
Sure. If I had known what a huge thing that would become in my life, I would have said no. It was a time in New York, Manhattan, where I was living then, when women, particularly women writers, poets, but visual artists absolutely as well, were thrilled with what was happening in the sense of women's voices being heard. At the same time, that being thrilled had quite a bit of, well, let's just say anger behind it, because the rest of that story is not having been heard and the struggle to be heard. And in those years, which were give or take what, late 70s. Ooh, yes, it's true. I was part of a cohort, loosely speaking, of women of the sort that I'm talking about, wonderful writers, whatever. I was also directing something called Writers in Performance that was for a decade at the theater in New York called the Manhattan Theater Club. And so my life was full of, at that point, people who wrote. But I was so interested in what everyone was saying, I thought surely there has to be a book uh, that captured this quality of that time. And so I went to a bookstore, for those of you who may know New York, on the Upper West Side, and I looked all around. There was no such book. And as I have said and like to say, because it's the truth, the book began because I needed to read it. I certainly did not have the self-consciousness of knowing, as I do now, that it was the first book ever of its kind. I commissioned essays. These are not interviews. I commissioned essays for the first book. There's a second volume as well, 10 years later. But I could always, from people whose work I admired, from a very diverse range of, let's just say, identities, meaning poets, novelists, essayists, every kind of diversity in every other sense. And I worked very closely with each of the writers in shaping the essays and then putting the book together. Well, yes, it is, I suppose, an anthology because it didn't exist, and making it exist, it really became a creative act in itself. How to order it, how to juxtapose, how to think about what I wanted to say, and how to introduce it. That said, it was not until, I think, at least for me, the anniversary edition that my publisher Norton brought out in 2000. So yes, that tells you it was 20 years. Did I realize something else? And that is the writer, Julia Alvarez, just came out with a new book. So we've all continued. That's great to say. Julia wrote a new introduction. And in it, she says, it was a first. Women claiming their rooms in the house of literature. I wanted people to talk about, not talk about, to write about. Writing was really important because I wanted these to be things that were already in each person wanting, much like Fantasia, now that I think about it, that urgency to write. And I think that distinguishes the book. And I did ask people essentially, what does it feel like in personal terms and in speculative terms to be a contemporary woman who writes?
Brilliant. No, great stuff. Yeah. Now, I know this went on to volume 2, didn't it, as well?
I did. That was not part of the original plan. In fact,
I had the feeling it wasn't.
well, there were two reasons. First of all, forget numbers. I always do this: two reasons, and then there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But in any case, I thought if I were to do a second volume, I could become somebody who just went on doing that sort of thing. And I just repeating myself, of which I have a dread. And two things happened. There were two. One was there was a change. The authors, writers, artists, well, writers mainly in book one were all from the United States. 10 years later, that ferment that I was talking about had become essentially worldwide. Again, you could argue, well, perhaps not here or there, but the emphasis was on the change from the internal life to an engagement with the world, because we were no longer, we women who wrote, struggling with ourselves. We were struggling with, and I think prevailing with, what it is to be alive in the world. And so there is Elizabeth Joly from Australia, Ursula Le Guin, of course, from the United States, Margaret Atwood from Canada. I won't go on with the whole list because I'm not remembering them all that well at this point, but that was the first sense. I would not be repeating myself because what life had suggested something else. The other, and this is much more personal, is that at that point in my life, I was living with a very demanding day job at a foundation. And I was on jury duty, which meant I had a little space of time. And I thought to myself, if I don't do another book, I'll die. Now, that sounds melodramatic, but I felt that way. And if anybody here is listening who themselves, as I'm sure there are people who make things, create things, you'll know that feeling. And so I said, it's time. And happily, Norton wanted me to do another book. The subtitle, they both have the same title, The Writer on Her Work, which is a bit of a mistake because people get confused. But the second book has a different subtitle, and it is New Essays in New Territories.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's fascinating what I've been reading of both these volumes. So now, the other topic I want to touch on before we go on to obviously your new book is about your I'm just my own words here today. It's difficult. It's about Virginia Woolf, because I know you did a documentary, a mini documentary involved about Virginia Woolf. I want to learn about this because obviously, first of all, then, where did your interest in Virginia Woolf come from?
Well, I think it was the deep interest was first by reading her book, The Waves.
Oh, I love The Waves. I love The Waves, yeah.
You too? How wonderful. People might think, oh, it's because she read A Room of One's Own. Well, of course I did. But with The Waves, I felt this deep sense of two things: a kindred spirit who was taking huge chances, and somebody who was just suggesting a direction for myself, for literature. The way that The Waves is both prose and poetry, it didn't make distinctions. It became such a beautiful rendering of these lives, 6 of them, separately and together over a lifetime. I go back and I reread it. It offers something new each time. Now, I read the other ones, Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, of course. And as you can hear, Mrs. Dalloway's not my favorite. I just heard my tone of voice. I like it. Not the waves just did it for me. I thought, I just love the way this person is in the world. At the same time, I was aware, and this is before the novel and the film, The Hours, before, I have a lot of kind of befores in my life, which I'm pleased about. I thought, people think of her, and I obviously did reading, whatever, as kind of this wispy aristocrat who was virtually disembodied, and was all mind and all kind of aristocratic, whatever. But if you read her, you feel her to be a human being. That's the way in which literature can get us to reveal our best selves, not necessarily our entire selves, but enough. And she became embodied for me, a person who lived in the world in whatever terms were necessary for her. And that started my desire to make this film. Now, at that time, I was working, I had a really good day job, a wonderful one, for public television in the United States. For those of you who are listening, you might think, oh, was it this station, that station? The answer is no. It was a very brief period of time when one could do something and it was broadcast nationally, kind of because that was part of it. And one of the things that my division did was have films that were made by the BBC that sometimes were either too short or too long. One of my jobs was to find what they called then fill if it was too short. And at that point, even though I found many such and they became part of the whole 90-minute presentation, I went to my then boss and said, could you give me some money? I want to make a short film and I want to make it about Virginia Woolf. So those were very good days. I did get that money and many things happened as a result of it. The film itself, and then a fellowship I got from the National Endowment for the Humanities to go to England and to meet the remaining people from Virginia Woolf's Bloomsbury world. So it became quite a rich, ongoing, even now, experience with Woolf.
Wow, no, that's some story straight away. I'm glad you shared that with us. So, I think it highlights for yourself, Janet, that people are wondering here today, is I think the greatest creative people have got a very restless streak in them. And I think Virginia Woolf, I always believe, definitely did as well. And I think it, in some ways, it's probably influenced you in your own work there, I think, with that. Because the book we're going to talk about today is obviously looking at Mexico. Mexico looks back. And you were telling me before, obviously, we started chatting, like you've lived in, like, obviously, Boston, then you lived in LA, didn't you, when your husband got a job in the California Institute of the Arts. And then you obviously lived in Mexico as second home for quite some time. So tell us about then what drew you originally to Mexico.
I'll do it. I could go on for a very long time. I promise you, I will not. If you live in the East Coast of the United States, a little while ago, not very much was known about Mexico. There was kind of a sense of flouncy skirts and cucaracha. Just lots of stereotypes. And at that point in my life, I had a job. This is post-public television, working as the media person for a foundation. And we had a conference in Toluca. And I just had heard this little thing that said, there's something called Oaxaca, and it's great. Went on a plane to Oaxaca and had an experience that you'll your listeners will take with a grain of salt or not. As the plane was starting to land in Oaxaca, I felt a kind of little breeze go by me. And I heard, and of course there are quotes around this heard. I don't know what it was, but it was one of those experiences one has that one can't really figure out. But a voice that said, "There's something here for you." And as the plane landed, I got off the plane and I just smelled that wonderful corn, that maize, the corn tortilla smell wafting up to me. And it was like, yeah, you know, when I was younger, I always thought I would fall in love with Europe, and it took me a long time to get there. Because I didn't have money, that's why. But I certainly liked being in Europe, but it was nothing like how I felt in Mexico. I felt something very deep in me responding, and I could put names on it. I could say it's the kindness of people. I could, which is true. I could say that it was the colors. I could say it's music. But you can't really pin something down when you feel. I'm hesitant to stay at home. It's not my home. I'm not, essentially somebody whose grandparents came from Russia, Poland. You never know where you find your home, do you?
No,
So
no.
that's what started it. The story goes on to a an earthquake, actually, in California in the 90s that pretty much destroyed the college that I was closely associated with. And as a result of that and of trying to rebuild, I had some time and had 3 months, the only time I'd ever lived outside the United States, went to Mexico, to the town that subsequently we live in. At the time, I thought, oh no, I really want to go to Oaxaca. This is too much of a gringo town. And indeed, there are a lot of gringos in San Miguel de Allende, but there's a lot of everything else there as well. And as I began saying, I'm out of here, I'm going back to Oaxaca, I ended by buying a house there in San
Oh,
Miguel.
typical.
So
That's
that was
typical, yeah.
yeah, that was 1995. Yes. And there's more to the story, and you can either ask me, but I'll just sort of lay it out here. Those first years, and from point of fact, 28 years going back and forth as a second home. But in 1998, something amazing happened. At that point, I had written several, well, obviously the writer on her work, but other books. I had made other films. And now that I mention it, the first film, when I was in public television, was a feature film about a Mexican American theater troupe. And I had discovered what I wanted to do with that. And I guess right at the get-go, there was something there that responded, although many years later is when I went to Mexico, if you're following that roundabout. But of course, trying to trace a pattern is always interesting. Anyway, the amazing thing was I had finished a book. I was very tired. I was no longer seeing what was around me because a good deal of that book is set both inside myself and in the past. The book is called Phantom Limb. And yes, it is available in all the places where books are sold, which is the line you're supposed to say. And I couldn't see the world around me. I just sort of lost a visual sense, and that felt terrible. So what did I do? I went to Mexico just for a short while, and I gave myself a kind of assignment, although I wouldn't put it quite as harshly as that. The idea was to do very little. Instead of spending all those years in a book, to go for walks without a destination and see what happened. What happened is I looked in the window of a store. I said, I want to take a photograph. That was 1998, and I was at that point not a kid by any means, and it had a very obviously full life in film and in books and in theater. But suddenly everything changed. I still care about those disciplines, if one wants to call them that, those art forms. I'm still live with them and am part of them. But the act of seeing in my own way just overwhelmed me and has ever since. So that is part of my life in Mexico also.
Brilliant. Now, it's certainly when one's reading up on this book, it'll give people a good flavour for the book, I think, definitely. Now, obviously, then, we better ask the obvious question next, then, Janet. What made you want to do this book?
Oh, the emphasis there is this book, because by that time, I didn't realize this until the other day. A friend of mine went on Amazon, whatever. He said, you've got a lot of books on there. Oh, really? Because I don't think of myself that way. And three of those books are books of photography. And they all come from different sources, and they're very different from this book, which we can or cannot talk about. But when I got to Mexico and said to my husband, with a ticket in hand, as usual for all these years, I said, why are we going back? And that was the first time that each and both of us had the wherewithal in our lives to stay. My husband had been a college president for 30 years. He had stepped down. Our lives weren't determined by, spring break, things like that. And we tried it and we liked it. And 2 months later, we brought our dogs down. Standard poodles, if anyone wants to know. And that, of course, is a big commitment. Whither thou dogs are, so too you must be, yes? And so I was ravished by Mexico all over again. And that first year of living there, I took lots and lots of photographs. And I started looking at them in the way that I do, printing them out on an inexpensive computer, 8.5 by 11, push pinning them. Push pinning, is that? Yeah, push pin them on the walls of a studio I made for myself, looking at them. And I didn't feel comfortable. We now come to the answer of your book, to your question. I knew I had enough photographs for a book, but I didn't want to do that book because, with all due respect for many other wonderful books, everything from great Mexican photographers, although that's not the point, great foreign photographers like Paul Strand, who went to Mexico, contemporary people who do books that is their view of Mexico. I did not want to presume and say, this is Mexico. This is my Mexico, because it's not. And never will be, even though I have these deep feelings about it. And so I didn't do the book for some months. And then I got very lucky. Actually, I'd already had my publisher interested in such a book, just my work. But at that point, I had a bad back, and someone recommended a physical therapist, Jose Alberto Romero Romano, who came to the house, as people do in Mexico, a wonderful thing, treated my back, also looked at those images push pinned on the wall, started talking about them, started talking about all kinds of things. I felt I can really, this man is very special. I don't know how much he knows how special he is. Not that he's unsophisticated, but that he really was also a poet in the way that he thought. And the way
brilliant.
that I know, yes. I mean, not line break poet, but poet in the world. And everything he saw, he could relate to personal experience, to history in Mexico, to what it is that makes Mexico, Mexico. And I took a deep breath and I said, would you collaborate with me? And that was a risk because I didn't know if it would work. And I had to propose it to the publisher, who said yes. And he didn't know if it would work, although he didn't express this, but I'm very grateful to him because I could have been, a kind of, I don't know if this is a word in Manchester, but a flaky gringa who hadn't.
Yeah.
But it turned out we did this book together. The photographs came first. He would come to my house, usually in between appointments with patients. I would give him a group of images. This went on for at least initially a month. We'd sit, we'd have coffee. I did not record. Everyone said, why didn't you record it? No, I didn't want that. We had a conversation back and forth about what each image suggested to him. And then sometimes that would be what it suggested to me, and we would go on. It was a kind of sparking of minds across borders because we had very different experiences. He and I had to be United States, Mexico, whatever. We found places that were in common, places not literally, emotions, facts, life. And we also found very different ways of being in the world. But I ended up with many pages, so to speak, on the computer of what we talked about, which I then distilled into much shorter pieces of what he had to say. At one point, I thought it would be two of us, but it became too heavy, even though I'm a writer and I know I wanted to have my own writing in the book, and I do in the introduction and at the end. But it ended up being a book with my condensing what he said. He then, of course, I said, do you like this? Does this agree with what you think? And by and large, he did. And also, I made little changes as we went along. And then there was the very interesting thing of working with a designer in Germany, in Cologne, who had to find a way to take what he said in English and in Mexican Spanish. I worked with a poet on the translation, and integrate that with the images in such a way that it felt organic, not like a forced march or like captions, image, and much more work of art, I really think is what we were trying for. And it took a long time, not that long, in fact, not long at all for photo books, but it's just a lot of stuff together to make it all work. But that's where the title comes from. Looking at Mexico, Mexico looks back. It wasn't just me. It was a collaboration, and that was all the difference in the world.
Yeah, that's straight away. I've co-wrote books or done projects with people before myself, and when you're doing other people, it changes. Sometimes to the better, sometimes to the worse. But yeah, straight away, I agree with you completely over that. Now, you showed me, obviously, unfortunately today.
It wasn't just the change. It was of the working experience, which I may or may not do again. It was the honoring of this commitment that with this particular collaboration, I could move beyond my own point of view. And that was really, really important. End of story.
No, of course. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. Yes, I can see that. No, I agree completely. Now, you were telling me before, obviously, unfortunately, people are wondering today, there is no video of this because I've been having internet trouble before. But you showed me the size of this book. And obviously told me it is quite different to the size of the two previous monogram books you've done. What was the reason why this book was going to be a much larger book than the other book?
Yeah, when I say much larger, it probably simply means that it's probably 2.5 inches bigger vertically, which makes quite a big difference, I might add. I haven't really measured the width, It's on very beautiful paper that the press sent me various samples, and I got to pick the one I wanted, all of which is a way of saying I wanted this book to have presence in the world. All books do. The other books are beautiful also, they really are. But this felt to me, and it's subsequently been spoken of this way, as something new, as something groundbreaking, this crossing of borders, this trying not to do anything in my images that was straightforward documentary. I love documentary, but that's not what I do. It wasn't going to be folkloric. It wasn't going to be anything that had anything stereotypical about Mexico. And that's not because either Alberto nor I was dogmatic about it. On the contrary, it's that my first impulse in life was to poetry. And I still write poetry, and I've published a book of poems in which I tried to integrate image and word. That's another real interest of mine. But the sense of being in the world as what has someone, this is a quote from somebody else, a visual poet, imbues everything. It makes everything less literal. Everything has to have a quality of itself, but also of more layers of meaning. And that's kind of what I do, really. And Alberto was the perfect collaborator because he never said, as some people have said to me, what is this about? And about, to me, is a bit like pinning a butterfly to a wall, you know? It deadens things if you try to define it that way. So it kept everything fluid and interesting. It made juxtaposition of images and text much more interesting. And happily, Mexican friends of mine in San Miguel de Allende felt very strongly that this was the first book that they'd seen that didn't have any of the conventional images. I mean, it's not experimental images. They're pretty mostly straightforward, but there is this quality of there being more layers like that. I'm not even sure what I'm answering anymore. I'm just going on.
No, that's great. No, it answers that question brilliantly. That does. Now, there's obviously with the book itself, would there have been two of you, like I said before to you? You know, the process for doing a book to collaboration is always different. Now, I know you've done two monograph books before, and obviously, like you had just been those other two books, you'd have been sorting the order out yourself to a degree. But would there have been two of you doing it? Was your process quite different in this book?
Oh, completely. Well, not completely, because the photographs existed. They could have been a monograph. It just wouldn't have been the one I wanted. And so the process of coming to that and taking that chance and working daily with Alberto, I mean, everything about it was different. That said, the previous two books were different one from the other. As you talked about restlessness before, and restlessness can be geographic, it can be many things, and it can also be a creative spark. Not settling, or not even settling, it's not even conscious, it's just pushing forward. The first book was it was the result of a very big surprise. It was that moment of saying, I want to take a photograph, and going to the town square. Then San Miguel de Allende was a kind of village. Now it's a small city. And all that was available as a camera in that small square was a disposable, a throwaway, a single use, the thing they say, oh, you just use if you go on vacation or whatever. But it was all that was there. And it allowed me to do something I had never dreamt of. It was to find a new way of seeing in which using reflection, but not so that it's obvious, and using the downsides of disposable, which is that there's no depth of field. So everything appears on a single plane, and only automatic focus. So you can't kind of do the classic, oh, I like this, I don't like this. One will be in focus, one will be soft focus. I ended up with these images where people would often say, what is that? And I liked that. I enjoyed not having things be absolutely what they're, this, again, that dreaded word about. And it was a new way of seeing everything interpenetrated because of there being no depth of field. Nothing had sharp borders, which for me is as much a way of being in the world as it is a way of seeing. And that body of work, of which there's a lot, and it's the way I worked for a long time, became both image, philosophical, and something new in the world. And so as a neophyte, working with the most low-tech of all tools, for at least photography, I had a kind of people, well, a lot of good things happened. I had shows all over the world, actually. And then those images became the basis for the first book, which is called Overspilling World. That's a quote from the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, but it's this notion of an abundance, of an image containing more than you ever think it could contain, and everything being overspilling, not limited. And so that's also attracted the voices of several people to write essays about the work. One is the film director Wim Wenders, who I had not known before, but who saw the work and said yes.
Wow.
And ended up,
wow.
Yeah, I know. He ended up, the designer, who at that point was in the United States for this first photography book, we kept waiting and waiting. And, we were going to send the press a PDF in its entirety. Later, I worked more closely with designers, but I'm sorry, I'm not saying it well. I've always worked with marvelous designers, but the simple point of the story is that it was the last minute, and we had not got anything from Wim, and he was on location, and we left this little space in the book if we had to put in one line, and maybe the week before this thing arrived, it's a 4-page prose poem. And it's about the nature of photography and how Wim sees my work. And that was I've used the word thrilling several times in this interview, and I'm not embarrassed because there are times in life when things are thrilling. And then several other people wrote essays. The American photographer Catherine Opie, the art historian Pepe Carmel, the curator Alexander von Stosch. And so I had the great joy relatively early on of seeing my work understood and even framed as ideas, as related to other artists in a way that I would not have known otherwise. That was the first book, the celebration, as it were, of all that body of work done with a throwaway camera. If your next question is, as it might be, did you stay with that? No, because it was, you may remember, anyone listening may remember, suddenly it was really hard, certainly where I was, to get film developed. The world had become digital. Can you remember that moment in time?
I can indeed, yeah. Because my first cameras were disposable cameras, they were, yeah.
So I thought, well, I'm going to have to start using a digital camera. I went really high tech.
Wow.
No. I went to a low number iPhone, meaning I still stayed with very sort of, I suppose you could say, primitive tools then, although now, God knows, the iPhone 10 that I used for the Mexico book, the new book, is infinitely more sophisticated. But I should add one more thing, and that's true for all the work. I don't mind when something isn't razor sharp. I like blur. I mean, I just kind of, by the time I started making photographs, I was old enough that I could say, I don't have to do it like everybody else. I just want to find out what I want and what I like and explore that road. So the second book was different a lot because it was during COVID and I was in Los Angeles. And for reasons that are still a little mysterious to me, I felt I had to go out almost every day onto the empty streets and photograph a city without people, but where there were human traces that had been left behind. And so that became the second book. I've been walking. Obviously, there's a pattern, and the pattern is there's not a pattern.
Yeah, best way. Brilliant. Okay, right. Next thing I want to touch on, because I said there's lots I could ask. We could talk all day in this, and it's no joke either. What made you want to come up with the text on it in both English and Spanish?
Well, why the both? Because, again, since the commitment was to be across borders, so too did the language need to be that. I did not want to make a book that was only accessible to English-speaking people. It's as simple as that. And the book, I think the largeness of the book, which came from a sense, the physical largeness, that it had not been done before, that it had to have this presence, and even the typeface is larger than the usual monograph. I wanted it to feel intimate, accessible, open, available. And I think it does. Yeah.
Yeah. No, fair point. No, I agree with you. Certainly, what I've seen the PDF, you give yourself that accessibility. And I think that's essential nowadays, particularly when you're doing like setting a book in another country, when English obviously won't be the only language in it. Now, I've read...
let me just add one thing here. Often the art world, and even specifically within it, the photography world, it's not particularly pointed toward accessibility. Now, I'm sure there are people who are going to listen to your podcast who say, now, wait a minute, there's this example, there's that example. And then the answer is yes, but look at all the theory, look at all the denseness of things written about art. And I'm not sure, I think as I've got older, the notion of being more and more transparent has become important to me. Not to set up something that is, how shall I say, fancy, so fancy that it doesn't open itself to others. So I feel like with this new book particularly, I do this gesture which your listeners cannot see. It's with my elbows crooked and kind of pushing outward. That's a change in my life.
Brilliant. No, I agree with you completely with that. Okay, I was going to say, I loved one of the quotes I've read from Romario, actually, another interview where he stated, each picture, obviously, we talk about your book here, each picture we have looked at and looked at again more deeply becomes more of a mystery. I think the photographs is, but there's a lot. What's good about real good photography is the mystery is in it. Like, you're showing what's on all and not in this book. And I think it's a very, very brave move to do. You've not glamorized it at all. And I think you added to the mystery by showing the darkness of Mexico here.
Was that a question?
Sorry. It's more of a comment now. I'll delete it. Right, don't worry.
Then I'll answer it as a comment.
Yes.
Yes. By Alberto saying becomes more and more of a mystery, I am quite sure he is saying, and I would feel the same way, that as artists, certainly I've never wanted to mystify. I've never wanted to make something like, intentionally difficult to penetrate. But I do believe in mystery as a way of being in the world, and have come more and more to like not knowing, that there's a great freedom in not knowing exactly what one is doing. And what that leaves the door open to is layers and levels. And I will just tell you a lovely thing. Alberto and his family, his wife and his young son, have become friends, and I hope will be lifelong. But early on, when not that early, but after we'd worked together and I had a little gathering at the house to present the book to them, and his wife took me aside, and she's a very super intelligent woman. She's the head of programming and education at our botanical garden, our being the town. And she said, "Thank you for showing me a side of my husband that I hadn't known before." And that just made me so happy because, we live in the world, we have our responsibilities. He has to make enough money just to keep up life. All the things that make us defined by our professions, whatever. But the fact that there was this other quality in him, and she felt that it corresponded to a quality in me. She'd heard us talking together, and that's the quality we explored. Mystery in finding more and more in the image. Literally, he sometimes saw things I didn't see, and an image reveals itself slowly. I've never wanted to do anything that you can just look at and go, "Oh yeah," and turn the page. But it's also about that very elusive quality. I don't even know how to put it without it sounding pretentious, but it has to do with depth,
Yeah, no, agreed.
Instead of one level. Yeah, instead of one level.
Agreed with you completely. And that's why it's definitely a book for people who are interested today to go and check it out, because it really is. It's such a multi-layered book, and I've really enjoyed it. So I could definitely recommend that to people.
I hope people get to see it. Yeah, I hope people get to see it, because it's a really gorgeous book. I mean, I'm talking ideas now, and nobody here can see it, but it's really rather unusually physically beautiful. We worked very hard, the designers and I, on all the color corrections. The paper is very special. Everything glows. It's I wish you could see it. You've only seen the PDF. Why don't you ask Nanda to send you an actual copy?
I will speak to her afterwards, definitely with that one. So yeah, that's fine, definitely. Now, do you think that the pair of you will do another book together?
Another book? Oh no,
yeah,
not a chance.
Fair enough then.
We will have a friendship together.
Yeah, of course.
At one point, I thought maybe we would do some events together, and we still might. We worked out a scenario of how images would progress and how he would read some of the text and I would show the photographs and we'd talk in between. And that was offered to us. Right now, it's a time in my life when I am preferring to let the work just speak for itself, even though you and I are having this conversation. But I'm not quite sure I want it, I'm not sure I just want to do that. I think he and I will go on having a conversation, and I really hope for the rest of our lives, because something special happened. We just got it. It's hard in life to get it with another person, especially when you're a little, not odd exactly, but not all that regular either.
Yeah, of course.
But I don't think I will. I will tell you, I already have another book on the boil.
Good. You've answered my next question then. So tell us about the next book on the boil then, definitely.
Well, it's something that is completely different. It's quite a delightful book. I realized at one point not too long ago that I had this attraction and took photographs of things that ordinarily you would say are useless, like machinery that didn't reveal what you're supposed to do with it, or odd dials or old machinery. But it became really much more than that, a kind of way of seeing things that, um, well, it's sort of a play on what is useful, which is much too much wanted in our culture, I believe, broadly speaking, our culture being largely the West, um, and what is seen as useless. And so this is a book that celebrates other people's notions of uselessness, perhaps, but things that delight me because they're funny. And I've never done a funny book, not like haha, but a delightful book. And I've showed this to some people on my computer, simply, but everything juxtaposed. It's everything color corrected, so it could be ready to go. And at first, people were like, yeah. And then they start laughing. And it's not the laughter of haha. It's the laughter of, oh, I get it. That's really kind of great. That sign, it's a stop sign, but you can't really see OP. You see ST, and well, it's terrible to try to describe an image, but they're very different one from another. And I got a big kick out of it. So one
Brilliant.
changes.
Yeah,
One
brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah, I'm always a believer in any book you do. And I'm interested in your reaction, opinion of this as well before we wrap up today. Is do you think each book that you write is a reaction to the book you've completed before?
These books are a reaction to what I've completed.
Yeah.
Help me
Yeah.
out a little bit more. In the sense that this new book were photographs I'd already taken, but in taking them, they were a reaction to themselves,
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
Go out in the world for that book. I discovered them. In 2018, I had a rather nasty accident, and that meant I couldn't go out in the world for a while. Walking with my camera was not something that was going to happen. And at a certain point, I thought, boy, I sure have to do something. Otherwise, I will just let myself get dragged down and maybe feel sorry for myself. So I kind of set myself two things. One was to write a review for the Los Angeles Review of Books, a very wonderful publication of a 600 and something page book
Wow.
called Figuring by Maria Popover. Some people may know her blog. And it's, again, a very unusual book, and I think a brilliant book. So I really had to spend time thinking, looking, whatever. The other, and here goes to what you were saying, I realized that I had photographs that, if I put them together, would allow me to see the world differently. And this was specifically photographs that I put together in a limited edition book which I called City of Shrines. And they're not literally shrines. It's not an altar. It's not a saint. It's not whatever. It was pictures of things that, if you thought of them differently, you could see them as shrines. There's one of someone threw out a mattress, and the mattress is lying on the sidewalk, and it's against a tree. But somebody has put a stone, it's really a large rock, right in front of the mattress that's just lying horizontally. And it's almost as though that stone is demarcating a space outside, which is ordinary life, and the space inside, which is this discarded mattress. And it felt as though there was a quality of shrine, by which I mean celebration, by which I mean other than the regular, lots of different things. And then I thought, well, I have these images. I'm going to try writing as well. And everything I wrote was pretentious and too much and not right. But because I did have time, known as recovering from an accident, I started thinking, well, this isn't it. And I thought about some American poets, American meaning United States poets, particularly Frank O'Hara, for those who know his work. And his work, while serious, is also lighthearted. So it ended up, I discovered a way of writing about the images, usually just 3 or 4 lines that were oblique, not illustrative. And anyway, it was also a way of working with what existed. I don't think I make a big distinction now that you mention it. There's all this, I take a lot of pictures. I hadn't planned to, but I do. The world just kind of comes at me and I go, I want to come at it. And I look through, my program of images. I move things around. I think about what they say to me. I go out, I take more, I look some more. I'm always surprised. It's pretty organic, all of it,
Yeah, no, it's the best way. It's definitely the best way of anything you do creativity wise. It has to be natural. So I think if it isn't natural, you end up you will know yourself, to be honest with you. I agree
Yes,
completely.
you do know. You do know.
You do. Right.
Keep asking yourself,
Yeah, true. Now that's all my questions actually now on this part of the podcast anyway. So how can people get hold of you, Janet, if they want to track you down? How would you recommend it, first of all?
Well, the simplest way is to Google me by remembering how to spell my last name. And I'm going to say it because it's counterintuitive. First of all, the first name is Janet, just the way it sounds, Janet. The last name is Sternburg, Sternburg. I'm not going to tell you what everybody else puts in there instead because it'll just get the idea in your mind. But it would take you, if you did that, to somebody with a very similar name who is not me. But as soon as you put BURG, you get lots and lots and lots of information. In fact, I'm surprised at how much there is and pleased. And it will have my website for photography. It will have my website for literature. I believe, and I hope it is the case, that my Instagram account is another thing. I use my Instagram account kind of like a sketchbook. I don't put I put in just images that interest me that I've taken. And one way or another, if you are interested enough to go through the Google pages, it'll be pretty clear how you can get hold of me, or more importantly, get hold of the work. And that, of course, is available on Amazon. It's available, I think the phrase is, wherever books are sold. And that's a plug for independent bookstores. If you see a title and that interests you, go to your local bookstore and ask them to order it for you. That's really, really the best. You can go to the publisher's website. This new book is for sale there, and that's not hard to find either because the publisher's name is with the book on any of these websites. So I'm findable.
Definitely with that one. I've really enjoyed this today, Janet. So I just want to say thank you again. Really, really great stuff today. As Don Callis over at AEW Wrestling says to wrap up today, as always, stay safe and stay over, and we will see you all next time.
Spoken Label.